Welcome again. Thank you for joining. Today's program is part of the Presidential Primary Sources Project. The title today is President Grant's Vision of Justice, and it's being presented by the Ulysses S Grant National Historic Site. The Presidential Primary Sources Project is a program we put on every year from January to April. And it's a partnership between Internet 2, the National Archives, and the National Park Service. This is just a quick reminder, by participating today, you are agreeing to be recorded and archived. We do keep recordings of all of our programs on our YouTube channel so that teachers and students can access them later. All right, again, we're so excited to have you, and we want you to participate as much as possible. That said, just a few reminders about participating. If you would like to be on camera to participate, go ahead and drop a note in the chat and I will work on setting that up for you. There'll also, of course, be the opportunity to use the chat. So if you haven't already found that, it looks like a little caption bubble. Go ahead and click on that. We will use that a lot to ask and answer questions. That said, please make sure you're really respectful of our interactive tools. We want to make sure the questions we're asking and answering are directly related to what our presenter is talking about. Also, remember to adjust your display name so that when we call on you, we're calling on you according to how you would like to be called on. That'll help us, call out correctly. All right, I just want to thank you again for joining us. This is our website. If you want to check out some of our future programs, or if you're looking to find our recordings, you can get all that information here. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and pass it over to Nick.
Thanks, Therese. Really appreciate the opportunity to interact with everybody today. Welcome to the program. So I work for the National Park Service, and I do a few different things with the Park Service. I'm a park ranger. I do education programs. I educate people about Ulysses S. Grant's life and times. I'm also a historian, and I'm a museum curator. So a curator is somebody who works to put together museum exhibits and works to care for historical artifacts. So with the Park Service, I take care of about 700 historical artifacts connected to Ulysses S. Grant. So I do a lot of different things with the National Park Service, but it's never a dull moment. It's a lot of fun. And I'm excited to share some really interesting stories about Ulysses S. Grant with this presentation. So I'm going to try to get to a full screen here. I'm sharing my screen, and I just need to get to full screen here. Okay. Sorry about that. All right, we are full screen and ready to go. So we're going to learn about Ulysses S. Grant today. And the site that I work for with the National Park Service is called Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site. We are located in St. Louis, Missouri, and we take care of one of the houses that Ulysses S. Grant lived in during his lifetime. He owned this house as well. Now, it's sort of misleading because this house is called Whitehaven, but it is painted green. The technical name for the color is Paris green, just like the city in France. But I have a coworker that calls it Kermit the Frog green. So I guess that's an appropriate term as well. But this historic home, Ulysses S. Grant's wife, Julia, she grew up at this house. It was Julia Grant's childhood home. Ulysses and Julia met at this house. They started their relationship here. Ulysses even proposed marriage to Julia on the front porch of this house. They lived at this house together with their family for about 5 years. And after the American Civil War, when Grant was president of the United States, he owned this house and occasionally came back and vacationed at the Whitehaven estate. So again, that's why the National Park Service is here in St. Louis at this site, to help people learn about Ulysses S. Grant and to give you an opportunity to go through President Grant's home. Now, Grant is originally from Ohio, so he's not from Missouri. But Grant went to college and he went to a place called West Point. And so at West Point, Grant trained to become a soldier in the U.S. Army. And upon graduation from West Point, he became an officer in the U.S. Army. And long story short, he served in the Army for about 11 years. The Army sent Grant to forts all around the country. He even served in Mexico during what was called the Mexican-American War. And during this time, Ulysses did come to St. Louis and he met Julia and began his relationship with Julia here in the St. Louis area. So in any case, Grant, even though he liked being in the U.S. military, there were certain aspects of life in the military that he didn't like. Most notably, he constantly had to move around. Some of you may know somebody who serves in the military today, or maybe used to serve in the military. Maybe you have a relative in your family who served in the military. And if you talk to that relative about their military service, there's a good chance they probably moved around a bit. They probably didn't stay in the same spot for very long. And that was the case for Grant as well. So after 11 years in the Army, Grant was tired of always being away from Julia and his children in St. Louis, tired of being away from them all the time. So Grant made the decision to leave the U.S. Army. And just a few years before the American Civil War, and you don't have to memorize this date, but in 1854, Grant left the Army, came back to St. Louis, and he decided to become a farmer here at the Whitehaven estate. So for several years, for about 5 years, Grant was raising fruits and vegetables like corn, wheat, potatoes, and apples while living here at the Whitehaven estate. So that greenhouse I showed you a couple slides ago, here is what Whitehaven looked like in 1860, right before the Civil War. This is the way the house would have appeared when Grant lived at the property in the 1850s. So Grant tried his hand at farming. He did his best to try and support his family, but it was very difficult. Being a farmer is difficult because you have to deal with bad temperatures outside. Sometimes your crops are not worth a lot of money. It's a tough way to make a living. And so Grant, after 5 years of farming at Whitehaven, he ended up giving up this occupation. He didn't want to become a farmer anymore. But what is going to happen is that the American Civil War breaks out in 1861. Now, using the chat function, do we know what side Grant fought for in the Civil War, when the Civil War broke out? Okay, so I see several folks saying that it was the Union, and that is correct. So we saw 11 states in the South. They tried to leave the country. This was largely over disagreements over the institution of slavery and the future of the United States. And so these 11 states, when they left, they formed a new country called the Confederacy. They attempted to create a new country, but Grant was opposed to this. He believed it was wrong. He believed that it was important to try to keep the United States together. So he joined back into the U.S. Army, fighting for the Union, fighting to keep the country together. And nobody could have predicted it, but Grant ended up rising through the ranks. And as he moved up through the ranks, President Abraham Lincoln took note of Grant's accomplishments, and he selected Grant to be the top general in charge of the entire U.S. Army. So by the end of the Civil War, Grant was in charge of more than 1 million soldiers, a huge responsibility for Grant. We have parts of Grant's uniform in our collections. So one of the things I helped take care of is this hat badge. This is a badge that Grant wore on a hat that he wore during the Civil War. And actually right below that, this image of Grant wearing a hat, that badge right there, that's the badge that we have in our museum today. That's one of our historical artifacts here. So in any case, Grant is trying to lead the Union war effort. He's working with President Lincoln. And for the last year of the war, Grant was leading forces in Virginia. And he was leading forces against the top Confederate general, Robert E. Lee. And Grant and Lee were directly fighting each other for about a year in Virginia, a number of horrible battles, a lot of casualties. The American Civil War today remains the deadliest war in American history. Recent estimates suggest that as many as 750,000 soldiers died during the American Civil War. So it is very brutal and it's very difficult for Grant, but he is going to force General Lee's hand. And in April of 1865, 4 years after the Civil War began, General Lee decided to surrender his forces to General Grant. So they did that at a place called Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, and the National Park Service actually takes care of this house. It's called the McLean House, where the surrender took place. And you can go in this room and see where General Lee surrendered to Grant. So the American Civil War solved two different issues. One is that it kept the Union together. We still remain a unified country today, now with 50 states, because of the American Civil War and Union victory over the Confederacy in the Civil War. And it also led to the end of slavery. After the Civil War, we made a change to our Constitution called an amendment. We have 27 constitutional amendments today. And the 13th Amendment that we added ended slavery in the United States. So the 13th Amendment is going to come shortly after the end of the Civil War and leads to the end of slavery. Now, after the Civil War, there were a lot of questions about the future of the United States. And the United States experienced a new era. And today we call this era the Reconstruction Era. So let me ask you another question. You're going back to that chat function. What do you think of when you hear the word Reconstruction? What comes to mind when you hear the term Reconstruction? I'd love to see your answers in the chat. Okay, so I see somebody wrote down rebuilding. That's a good definition. Okay, what else? Building something again. Okay, very good. So something that has been destroyed or something that is on the brink of absolute destruction and trying to bring that back up again. I see somebody with their hand raised. Go ahead.
Fixing things.
Fixing things. Very good. Yes, I like that. I like that. Okay, somebody else said after the Civil War. So that's another, we use Reconstruction to refer to the period after the Civil War. All very good answers, right? So the United States, a lot of questions, and here are some of the questions that emerged during the Reconstruction era. So how do we restore the Union? How do we bring those former Confederate states back into the Union? And how do we do it while maintaining peace? How do we promote peace and avoid another civil war in our country's future? Another important question is the newly freed African Americans. There were 4 million enslaved African Americans when the Civil War broke out, but now with the end of the Civil War, they are free. So what rights do African Americans have? Should they have the same rights as white Americans? How are we going to ensure that they're able to receive an education, to be able to get jobs, to earn money, and to be able to become sort of assimilated into American society? So a lot of debates about the rights of what we sometimes refer to as the freed people after the Civil War. And of course, there's questions about whether the Confederacy, people who supported the Confederacy should be punished. So should General Lee be punished for serving in the Confederacy? Should the high political leaders like President Jefferson Davis be punished? Should the soldiers who fought in the war for the Confederacy, what rights do they have? So there's a lot of uncertainty about the future of the United States, even though we know that the Union's going to stay together and slavery is coming to an end. Now, fundamental to these questions is the term civil rights. Now, civil rights, as a definition, it's starting to emerge during the Reconstruction era. Let's go back to the chat function, or if you want to raise your hand. What do you think of when you hear civil rights? What does that term mean? Okay, Edgewood, go ahead.
Equal rights or equality.
Okay, equal rights, equality, so the rights for all people. I see another comment, rights for everyone in the chat. Somebody said thinking of African Americans having rights. Very good, very good. So yeah, civil rights pertains to rights that are protected. They're rights that are guaranteed to all Americans, and they're supposed to be protected by the government. So civil rights apply to African Americans, and we often use the term civil rights in relation to African American rights, but honestly, civil rights are rights for everybody. They're rights that apply to everyone regardless of their background. Doesn't matter what gender you are, what your religious beliefs are, how much money you have, what your skin color is. Civil rights are rights that apply to everybody. They're protections that we all have as Americans. So during Reconstruction, one of the most important lessons of Reconstruction is this idea that everybody should be entitled to civil rights. Prior to the Civil War, when slavery exists, sort of the popular belief was that African Americans, because they were enslaved, most were enslaved, they were not deserving of civil rights. They're not deserving of rights that were protected by the government. But during Reconstruction, we're going to undertake a remarkable experiment in civil rights and a remarkable experiment in democracy. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of these civil rights accomplishments of Reconstruction. So in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, another amendment was added, the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment said that newly freed African Americans were citizens of the United States. And it went on to say that if you're born in the United States, you are an American citizen. So if you were born in the United States today, you are automatically an American citizen because of the 14th Amendment that was ratified during the Reconstruction era. There were also rights that were put in place to ensure that the freed people would be able to sign contracts and would be able to earn money for their work. When they're enslaved, the vast majority of enslaved people don't have the ability to earn money for their labor. That changes during the Reconstruction era. There's also going to be guaranteed rights to go to court. If you have an issue with somebody, you have the right to file a lawsuit. You can issue testimony in court. And if you were a witness to a crime, you can provide your testimony in court. And most importantly, civil rights are going to pertain to this idea of equality before the law. So again, regardless of your background, you have rights that are protected by the U.S. government. So Ulysses S. Grant, for several years after the war, he remained the top general in the U.S. Army. But General Grant was beginning to get pretty concerned about the future of the United States because there were some political leaders, most notably President Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Abraham Lincoln after Lincoln was tragically assassinated. President Johnson did not support African American rights. He did not support African Americans having the right to vote or to participate in elections. And Grant was getting very concerned because there was a lot of violence in the South against African Americans. So a lot of disaffected former Confederates they did not want African Americans to have expanded civil rights. And there started to be a lot of violence in the South. Grant did not want to be president of the United States, but likewise, he didn't want Andrew Johnson to be president anymore either. And he came to the conclusion that he felt that if the American people wanted it, he felt that he could be a good candidate to represent the country in the White House. So when Grant ran for president in 1868, he came out in support of African American men having the right to vote. Women, unfortunately, not going to get the right to vote for another 50 years until 1920. But at this point in Reconstruction, he wanted African American men to have the right to vote. And Grant also supported a third constitutional amendment, the 15th Amendment, and that would open the door for all men, regardless of color, to have the right to vote. So Grant came out and supported the 15th Amendment. Grant's campaign theme was "Let us have peace." It's a nice, catchy slogan. And by let us have peace, Grant called for the nation, for North and South to stop bickering, to the end of sectional strife, the end of racial resentment and racial violence against African Americans, and a better future for the United States based on peace. Grant in 1868 ended up winning the election. So Grant was elected as our 18th US president. And not too long after Grant was elected president, the 15th Amendment was ratified. Now, an amendment, the process of adding an amendment to our Constitution is very, very difficult. That's why we only have 27 amendments, even though we've existed as a nation for more than 225 years. So if you want to add a constitutional amendment to the nation, to our Constitution, this is what you have to do. The amendment has to be proposed in Congress. Congress is the lawmaking body in Washington, D.C. that establishes federal laws for us. That amendment has to be approved by 2/3, so 66% of the members of both the House and the U.S. Senate have to approve that amendment. Once the amendment is approved, it goes to all the individual states, and the individual states have a vote on that amendment. So to get that amendment ratified, you have to have 3/4. So 3 out of every 4 states, 75% of the states, have to ratify that constitutional amendment. So it's a long, drawn-out process. You have to think very, very hard about that constitutional amendment. The last constitutional amendment in our country was added in 1994. So it's been almost 30 years since we've added an amendment to our Constitution. But in any case, the 15th Amendment was ratified under President Grant's administration in 1870. I like this drawing. It's not historically accurate. The president has no role in the ratification of a constitutional amendment, but this drawing shows Grant sitting at a table with a pen, acting as if he's going to sign the 15th Amendment into the Constitution. This is also historically inaccurate because Abraham Lincoln is sitting right next to President Grant. And of course, we know that President Lincoln, tragically, he had passed away. He was not alive to see the 15th Amendment come into being. But I like this cartoon because it shows the different sorts of rights that African Americans were fighting for. So by having the 15th Amendment, African Americans would have the right to vote in elections. So in the top right corner, we see a group of African Americans who are lining up and getting ready to cast their vote in an election. To the left, it says justice for all in the top left corner, and it shows African Americans participating in court proceedings, offering testimony to the court, African Americans serving as lawyers and judges in the courts. African Americans also serve in the U.S. military, so through military service, they're fighting for their citizenship and voting rights. And on the bottom here, we can see African Americans participating in the fine arts, becoming speakers, artists, performers, and they're also becoming successful farmers, and they're having their own businesses as well. So this political cartoon is trying to make an argument about the positive benefits of the 15th Amendment. Here's another political cartoon I really like. So we see African Americans that are going to the polls and they're casting their vote. So back in the 1800s, you had to go to a public place like a school or a business or a government building like a post office. And you would have usually either a chip or a newspaper clipping, and you would put it in the jar, or you would cast your ballot that way. Now, looking at this cartoon, we have a group of African-American men, but what does it look like they're doing? What do their outfits suggest about what their jobs were and who they were in the community? Let's go back to the chat, and you can raise your hand too. What kind of jobs do these African-Americans have in this cartoon? Okay, Edgewood, go ahead.
Are they soldiers?
So there is one soldier. So the third man from the left is wearing a U.S. Army uniform. So that shows how Black soldiers participated in elections as well. I see that. What else, Edgewood? Go ahead. Go ahead,
Is what a
Edgewood. Yep.
silversmith?
Good question. Yeah. So the man in the front, he's like a carpenter. And somebody else, Beth in the chat, you mentioned a mason. So it might be like a stonemason or a carpenter. So he represents African Americans who developed a trade, who made their living by working a trade. Edgewood, one more time. Go ahead if you want to unmute.
One of them looks like a businessman that I can't say.
Very good. Very good. Yes. So the man in front is kind of like a construction worker, a laborer. The man right next to him with this fancy hat is kind of like a businessman. He's more of like an elite businessman who owns his own business. And then there's a soldier behind him. So all these different occupations that African Americans would have been working during the Reconstruction era. Very good. Thank you. Here's another cartoon I like. During Reconstruction, we saw a record number of African Americans who served in elected offices. So, for example, there were 14 African American men who served in Congress in the House of Representatives. So not only do they have the right to vote, but they're actively working to write the laws here in the United States. There were 2 senators who were African Americans during Reconstruction. Many states had officers at the state level, like a treasurer who controlled the money for a state, or there was a governor of Louisiana at one point who was African American. There were more than 1,500 African Americans who served in elected offices during the Reconstruction era. So again, to imagine that some of the men in this cartoon were enslaved in 1860, but by 1870, they're lawmakers. Pretty amazing to think about that. Now, it is important to keep in mind, again, that not everybody agreed with these changes. Not everybody agreed with these civil rights and voting expansions that happened during the Reconstruction era. Tragically, there were some groups, some white supremacist groups that emerged in the South. The most prominent one at the very beginning of Reconstruction was called the Ku Klux Klan. And the Ku Klux Klan was a secret organization. Oftentimes, the men in the Ku Klux Klan would disguise themselves. They would put a hood over their head so that other people couldn't see what their identity was. And members of the Ku Klux Klan, oftentimes they would go to the polls and they would watch and see which African Americans in their community were voting in elections. They would then use that information and they would sometimes go to the homes of African Americans and they would commit acts of violence. Sometimes it was simply intimidation and threats not to vote again, but sometimes it turned into actual gunfire and even murder against African Americans. And it's really hard to put into words how awful some of this violence was. And it's an important reminder that not everybody embraced civil rights during the Reconstruction era. And this cartoon very sadly demonstrates how the Ku Klux Klan would show up in disguises at African American homes and commit acts of violence. President Grant was really concerned about this. He was not happy about hearing instances of violence in the South, particularly acts committed by the Ku Klux Klan, and President Grant wanted to do something about it. So Grant is going to work with Congress to establish a number of laws to try to stop Ku Klux Klan violence in the South. There were 3 laws that were called the Enforcement Acts. And they're called the Enforcement Acts because essentially, as the term enforcement implies, the federal government is going to enforce these laws and ensure that all citizens had their rights protected. So collectively, these 3 enforcement acts allowed President Grant to call out the military. So if President Grant heard reports of the Ku Klux Klan committing acts of violence, President Grant was authorized to call out the U.S. military to go to those communities and to stop the Ku Klux Klan from committing acts of violence. This ended up being largely successful with regards to the Ku Klux Klan. Over several years in the 1870s, more than 3,000 members of the Ku Klux Klan were arrested for crimes, and more than 600 ended up being convicted of those crimes and serving prison terms for their acts of violence as members of the Ku Klux Klan. The federal government also, Yes.
We have a question in the chat. Do you know how big the Ku Klux Klan was at this time?
Good question. The Ku Klux Klan, because it was a secret organization, we really don't know the exact number of KKK members, but I can tell you that around the South at this time, it was several tens of thousands. I would probably guess somewhere maybe 20,000 members of the Ku Klux Klan. And I do think it's important to qualify that not all white Southerners embraced the Ku Klux Klan. Some former Confederates were opposed to the Ku Klux Klan. One of the top generals in the Confederate Army was a man named James Longstreet, and he actually came out in support of President Grant and support of expanded voting and citizenship rights for African Americans. So it is important to make that qualifier. But yes, tens of thousands of white Southerners joined the Ku Klux Klan. Thank you for that question. So the government's also going to try to ensure fair elections and try to ensure that African Americans can go and cast a vote in elections. And there was a new organization that President Grant called for to be established called the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice is still around today, and the purpose of the Department of Justice is to protect American civil rights. So the DOJ has its origins in fighting the Ku Klux Klan, but it still exists today as an important part of our government. Finally, there was a really interesting law that was passed towards the end of Grant's presidency called the Civil Rights Act of 1875. This Civil Rights Act is very interesting because it actually tried to stop racial segregation, so separating white people and people of color in public spaces, and it tried to end racial discrimination. This law called for the equal treatment of all Americans in public spaces. So restaurants and movie theaters and public transportation like horse-drawn carriages, these places could not racially segregate white people and people of color. It called for the end of racial discrimination. It also said that in our court system, there had to be equal access to our court system for all people regardless of color. Now, unfortunately, this law was later declared unconstitutional in 1883. So basically, the Supreme Court said that this law did not line up with the spirit of the Constitution, and this law was sadly overturned. And it's going to take another 80 years for Congress to pass another civil rights law. It won't be till the 1950s when Congress passes another civil rights law. But I think the Civil Rights Act of 1875 highlights the promise of the Reconstruction era to bring about a better future for all Americans. So in the end, Reconstruction was partly a success and partly a failure. Under President Grant's administration, the nation did stay together. The Union was maintained, and the Union is maintained still to this very day. And in that regard, Reconstruction was a success. Reconstruction was also a success because in some ways, it was the nation's first civil rights movement and introduced Americans to this idea of equal treatment before the law. But on the other hand, Reconstruction was also defeated. And it was defeated through white supremacist violence. We can see in this political cartoon here, there was people who believed that if the United States was a white man's government, and they tried to dismantle the civil rights gains of the Reconstruction era. There was a period after Reconstruction called the Jim Crow era, and Jim Crow lasted for about 80 years, and it was a direct response to the civil rights gains of the Reconstruction era. So in some ways, Reconstruction was a failure, but it was something that we're still kind of fighting for today. The modern civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s tried to play off of the gains of the Reconstruction era. So when we learn about people like Martin Luther King, we had Martin Luther King Day earlier this week, right? Martin Luther King made a speech towards the end of his life where he celebrated the Reconstruction era and said that it was a period in which democracy was brought to the South. And we can see here, this is the March on Washington. This is This was a protest that took place in Washington, D.C. This is the day that Martin Luther King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, and people were carrying signs calling for equal treatment for African Americans. And many of these African Americans understood the civil rights gains that came about during the Reconstruction era. So this is a political cartoon from Reconstruction that I really like. It's called Uncle Sam's Thanksgiving Dinner. And Uncle Sam is actually envisioned as sort of a handsome young man. So Uncle Sam is in the back right corner at the front of this dinner table, and he's cutting the Thanksgiving turkey. And as Uncle Sam is cutting this Thanksgiving turkey, there's people of all different ethnicities sitting at the table here. There's African Americans, there's people from Asia, from China, Japan, and other parts of Asia. There's an American Indian sitting in the back here. And in the middle of the Thanksgiving table is this statue, and it says universal suffrage, so universal voting rights for all. It says self-government. And in the back here, there's paintings of President Lincoln, President Washington, and President Grant on the back there. So Uncle Sam's Thanksgiving Dinner is this idea of America as a place that welcomes all people from around the world, and that these people get to enjoy equal rights in the United States. We're still working towards these ideals today. We are far from finished. The work of promoting civil rights continues today, but we can also celebrate the amazing civil rights gains that have come about in our country since the end of the Civil War. And some of those civil rights gains came during President Ulysses S. Grant's time at the White House. We have this at our visitor center today. This is a quote from President Grant. And President Grant said, quote, "My oft-expressed desire is that all citizens, white or black, native or foreign-born, may be left free in all parts of our common country to vote, speak, and act in obedience to law without intimidation or ostracism on account of his views, color, or nativity." All right, so that's all I've got. Why don't we go ahead? Let's open it up for questions. Okay, so I see a question here. This is a very good question. Grant does have a relationship with slavery. When he lived at the Whitehaven estate, this property was a plantation, and Julia's family, his wife Julia's family, enslaved upwards of 30 African Americans. So when Grant lived as a farmer here in St. Louis, he did enslave one man by the name of William Jones. So it is somewhat interesting that Grant is the last president in our country's history to have been an enslaver. However, before leaving St. Louis, Grant did end up freeing William Jones. He signed what was called a manumission document, and that manumission gave William Jones his freedom. So Grant did make that decision. And Grant, during the Civil War and later on in his life, came to believe that slavery was wrong. He said that slavery was a stain on the republic. And so in other words, it was an embarrassment to the country. And he went on to say that slavery was at war with the civilized world. So Grant did come around. He evolved in his thinking, and he came to regret having been a participant in the institution of slavery. But it is important to remember that he did have a relationship with slavery. So thank you for that very good, nuanced question. Really good. Okay, I see another question here. It says, did Grant get tired of being the head of the Army? That's a good question. The answer is no. Grant really liked being in the Army. And after the Civil War, when he was top general, he was very happy in that role and wished to remain in the Army. But he felt that if the American people wanted him to be president, he would put his name in the hat, although he did not want to be president. Grant famously said that when he left the White House, he said he was as excited as a boy leaving school to be leaving the White House. So that shows you how he felt about being president of the United States. Another question, is Grant celebrated as a president more now or closer to his presidency? Excellent question. Grant had success and failures during his presidency, and Reconstruction, as I've tried to highlight here, is very controversial, some of the things that he supported as president. So for many years, Grant was looked down as not a good president. And there were some challenges because some of the advisors and some of the people around Grant didn't always have the country's best interest at heart. There was some corruption during Grant's presidency that ended up sort of tainting his legacy as president. But I can tell you that every 10 years, a group of the nation's top historians, they do presidential rankings, and they rank all the presidents and try to give them an assessment of how successful they were. Back in the year 2000, President Grant was ranked number 33. He was towards the bottom of those rankings. But in 2020, so just 3 years ago, Grant moved up to number 20 on the rankings. So Grant did nothing new, but he moved up 13 positions in the rankings, and he's pretty well respected for his civil rights advocacy. So Grant is celebrated more now as a president than he was 20 or 30 years ago. I'll go back to the Zoom questions, but we have a student in Edgewood. If you want to unmute yourself, go right ahead.
Did Grant's parents help him with his election?
Good question. Grant's parents were still alive when he ran for president, and the extent of their support was basically they lived, when Grant was running for president, they lived on the border between Kentucky and Ohio. They lived really close to Cincinnati, Ohio. And so the Grant's parents, they would go around in the community and they talked about their son running for president and voiced their support for him running for president, but not much else beyond that. But interestingly, when Grant was elected president, he did invite his parents to come visit him at the White House. So that's kind of an interesting story because many presidents are a little bit older. Most presidents are in their 60s or 70s when they become president of the United States, and their parents aren't always around. But Grant was only 46 when he was elected president, so his parents did visit him at the White House. Okay. Beth, in the chat, you said, can you talk about Grant's relationship with American Indians and any policy he advocated? Wonderful question. Grant's policies towards American Indians were a very mixed bag. On the one hand, Grant genuinely believed that the U.S. military and the U.S. government had inflicted a lot of violence against American Indians and that this violence was wrong, and that the cause of this violence was the U.S. government. He acknowledged those wrongs. But Grant, his solution to fixing these problems of violence against American Indians was, in Grant's day, it was considered enlightened and progressive, but by our standards today, we probably wouldn't have those same views. Grant supported establishing what are called reservations. Reservations are areas of land where American Indians would be, and their tribes, these tribes would be brought to these reservations, and there on these reservations, they would be provided with food, clothing, supplies, and protection from the U.S. government. Again, at the time, some reformers supported Grant in the establishment of reservations because as more settlers are moving to the West, these reservations are going to protect American Indians from settler violence. But at the same time, many Indians looked at these policies and said, wait a second, you're taking away our lands that we've had for hundreds of years and forcing us to go onto these reservations against our will. And in many cases, Native Americans were forced to give up their culture and their ways of life. They were forced to essentially become Americans, to become English-speaking Christian farmers, rather than being able to live their lives they wanted to on the land. So there were some pretty bad battles between the military and various tribes during Grant's presidency. Most notable one is the Battle of Little Bighorn, if you look up the Battle of Little Bighorn. And so Grant's record when it comes to Native Americans, it's not as good as it is with African Americans. He had good intentions of trying to promote peace, but at the same time, he didn't always listen to what was best for the tribes and what they wanted to get out of Indian policy as well. Tony asked why the Ku Klux Klan was named the Ku Klux Klan. I don't have a great answer. It's a Greek term. So I think it's a Greek term for something about the loyal circle or the loyal group. But it is taken from the Greek language. Good question. Let's go back to Edgewood if you want to unmute and ask your question.
How old was Ulysses S. Grant when he died?
Good question. So Grant, he was 63 when he passed away. Now, by today's standards, 63 is not that old. That's not a very long life. Many people today live into their 80s and 90s. And I have a family member who's 101 years old, and she's doing great. But back in Grant's day, many adults didn't live past their 50s or 60s. And for Grant, he had one bad problem, and that is he was a heavy smoker. Grant enjoyed smoking cigars. He was known to smoke up to 20 cigars a day. So 20 cigars is pretty unhelpful, and Grant developed cancer. He developed throat cancer because of the smoking, and unfortunately, that's what he passed away from. So he died in 1885 at the age of 63. Edgewood, go ahead if you want to unmute and ask another question.
In one of the political cartoons that had the three men, there was a fourth man in the background. Do you know what that was about?
Good question. Yeah, so there were a few men in the back of that political cartoon, and since I'm still sharing my screen, I'll get to that so we can look at that together. We can see there's another man in the back. It's kind of hard to tell if he would be like a businessman or a laborer or what have you, but there's a couple more African Americans that are waiting in the line there to cast their vote. So that one's a little more tough to figure out what his job would have been. I'll go back to Edgewood in just a second, but I'm going to go back into the Zoom, the questions here. Did Grant have any relationship with African Americans as ex-president? Yes, he did. Grant, when he was president and after his presidency, developed relationships and partnerships with numerous African Americans. Perhaps most notably, he had a partnership with Frederick Douglass. So Frederick Douglass actually supported Grant as president of the United States and supported Grant's policies. Some of the men that were pictured in that cartoon I showed you of those men who served in Congress, they also maintained relationships and communicated with Grant as well. What did Grant do after his presidency? Good question. Grant and his wife, Julia, they went on a 2.5-year world tour. So they actually got on a ship and they traveled the world, and they traveled to countries all over the globe. So imagine going on a vacation for 2.5 years of your life and what that would be like going on a vacation for that long. So Grant did that after his presidency. And then the Grants moved to New York City. They actually had a house very close to Central Park. So Grant lived in New York City, and Ulysses and Julia are buried in New York City today for that reason, partly because they were living in New York when Grant died. Edgewood had a question in the Zoom chat. Was there any protection put in place to protect individual families from the KKK? The answer is yes and no. Usually state forces or local police forces did not always provide individual families protection from the KKK. And that's partly why President Grant supported enforcement acts so that the U.S. military would go down and provide that protection to African Americans. How many Native American tribes did Grant move to reservations? Good question. I don't have the exact number, but it was probably in the neighborhood of around 25 to 50 tribes. So numerous tribes like the Lakota, the Dakota, the Klamath, the Ponca. These are numerous tribes that were moved to reservations during Grant's presidency. Stephen also asked, didn't Grant have a Native American on his staff as general? And he did. That is correct. Grant had a man who was part of the Seneca tribe. His name was Ely Parker. And Ely Parker fought for the Union. He was on Grant's staff. And he was also in charge of the Bureau of Indian Affairs briefly when Grant was president. So Grant had a close friendship with Ely Parker and really looked to him and saw him as an important influence in the United States. Edgewood, let's go back to the video if you want to unmute yourself. Go ahead.
So we did a little research of Ulysses S. Grant today, and
Okay.
We found that he was a drunk. Is that true?
You know what? That's a great question. When people come to St. Louis and ask about Grant's drinking habits, we hear some of those same questions. And while Grant did drink, and he certainly drank to excess sometimes, that is kind of a myth. It's actually not true that Grant was this really bad, raging alcoholic. Grant actually, when he lived here in St. Louis, he did not drink while living here in St. Louis. And sometimes people that were sort of jealous of Grant's rise through the ranks in the military would sometimes claim that Grant was drinking because they didn't like that Grant was the one moving up through the ranks. So sometimes when people make claims like that, you have to look at the motivations of those people. Think about a situation in school where somebody might say something not so nice about you. What is the motivation of that person? Why are they making that claim, even if it's not true? That happened to Grant sometimes. So Grant drank, but we kind of take the position here at the park that he was not a drunkard or alcoholic. Good question. Edgewood, I see one more student. If you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
At that time, did they know it was bad to smoke?
So I think the question was, were people allowed to smoke? Was that the question?
No. Did they know it was bad for them to smoke?
Okay, good. The answer is no. Doctors back in the 1800s did not know about the harmful effects of smoking. And in fact, sometimes it was encouraged. Julia Grant, she actually said at one point that she encouraged her husband to smoke because she thought it would clear up his lungs. As a matter of fact, it really wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s when we learned about some of the bad effects of smoking, like cancer. So I grew up in the 1990s. And so when I was growing up, I remember the DARE program, and I remember hearing the commercials talking about the harmful effects of smoking. And that was all kind of new information in the 1990s. So thankfully today, there's not as many people who smoke, and most buildings are non-smoking because now we know about the harmful effects of smoking, but not the case in Grant's day. Therese, I'm just going to keep answering questions to the top of the hour, if that's okay, unless you have anything that you want to put in or anything to say.
No, we still have some time left. So yeah, you are welcome
Great.
to keep answering questions. Everyone who's
Okay.
joining, please feel free to keep putting questions in the chat. We'll go all the way up till noon Eastern. But if you have to
Okay.
hop off, of course, go ahead and do that.
Sure. Great. Okay. More excellent questions. Really appreciate the engagement with today's program. What happened to Ulysses and Julia's family? They had 4 children. All 4 children lived to adulthood. They had families of their own. There are still Grant family members alive today. So there's actually a young man. He's probably in his late teens or his early 20s now. He lives in France, and his name is Ulysses Grant Sartoris, but he's descended from General Grant. And there's some descendants living in the United States today. I actually know a descendant of the Grant family. He came here to Whitehaven and he took selfies with the Rangers in front of the house a few years ago. So there are still some descendants alive today. How did political cartoons help advocate for equal rights? Great question. Think about the 1800s. There's no radio. There's no TV. There's no audio recordings of any sort. One of the big mediums for communicating ideas is political cartoons, art. So political cartoons are very effective in trying to communicate ideas because they visualize ideas in a way that words can't always do it. So thinking again, going back to this picture I have up on the PowerPoint of the first vote, this idea of African Americans being able to exercise their rights at the polls. It's one thing to sort of communicate that through words, but it's another to communicate it through art. And so political cartoons are really important historical artifacts because they help convey ideas. And people still do political cartoons today. Think about today, if you go online, think about memes, or think about GIFs or GIFs, however you pronounce it. Those are oftentimes forms of political cartoons in the present. So we still use art and visual communication today as well. Beth asked a question. Do I have a personal favorite story about Grant, or what do I find meaningful about him? Boy, there's a lot that I do admire about President Grant, and I definitely admire his commitment to civil rights, acknowledging that mistakes were made along the way and acknowledging that we're still fighting for civil rights today. But I think Grant in fighting for, in particular, African-American rights is very noble. But I also admire how much Grant cared about his family as well. When Grant lived here in St. Louis, he was very poor. As a farmer, he didn't make a lot of money. And there's a story of Grant. He had a nice gold pocket watch. And with that gold pocket watch, he really cherished it, but he gave it up. He sold that pocket watch so that he can get money to support his family while living here in St. Louis. And I thought that was very selfless of him. And it's very important for him to know to care for his wife and children, to give up something he cherished in order to support his family. And that is one of my favorite stories of Grant, because it's not just about his life as general president, but also who he was as a husband, as a father, and just as he was as a personal, his personal characteristics as well. Edgewood asked, was Grant hated for his age? I wouldn't say that, but I do think some people were probably skeptical of a man in his 40s running for president. The minimum age to run for president is 35. I turned 35 last year, so I can run for president, but I assure you I will not be doing that. I like working for the National Park Service, but I believe the youngest president to be elected was John F. Kennedy. And I think he was like 42 or 43 when he was elected. So there's a couple different ways to look at it. On the one hand, they don't have as much experience, but on the other hand, sometimes it's good to have someone who's young with fresh ideas to be president of the United States. And so our past couple presidents, President Trump and President Biden, were older in their 70s and 80s. But of course, President Obama, I think he was in his mid 40s when he was elected president as well. Okay, so let me go through and move through a couple more questions. Was Grant buried with his wife? That is true. Ulysses and Julia are resting side by side. So they have a big tomb in New York City. They are resting together. That was Grant's only request, was that he wanted to be buried by his wife's side. Did Mark Twain help Grant publish his memoirs? That is true. Grant's personal memoirs are freely available today online. Grant wrote his life story. They're an important resource. And Mark Twain did help Grant publish the books. Grant wrote the books, but Mark Twain gave Grant a good book publishing deal. The first paycheck for Grant's memoirs was given to Julia, and it was $150,000. So the memoirs made a lot of money, and that was in part because Mark Twain worked with Grant to get the memoirs published. Where do cartoons come from? Who made them? I'll give you one name of a political cartoonist during Grant's time. His name was Thomas Nast, N-A-S-T. And if you search Thomas Nast online, there's hundreds of his political cartoons that you can look and learn about online. He was the most famous political cartoonist in Grant's day. Were African Americans allowed to be president of the United States? Hypothetically, any American citizen born in the United States is eligible to be president of the United States. So African Americans for a long time have been eligible to run, but sadly it wasn't until 2008 that we actually elected an African American to the presidency. Another question about political cartoons. Yes, they were in the newspapers. So if you read a newspaper back in the day, you would see political cartoons printed in those newspapers. Why did Ulysses S. Grant want to go to war? Because he believed his country was threatened with disunion. He was afraid the United States could cease as a nation, that it would no longer exist if 11 states in the South tried to leave the country. If they allowed those 11 states to leave the Union, there would be more states in the future that would leave the Union, and the spirit of the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution would fall apart. And that's why Grant fought for the Union. I see Edgewood leaving. Thank you so much. You guys have a great day. Thank you for the great questions and engagement. So Thank you for that. I think that is, boy, there's one more question I'll answer. What I think is the best book on Grant. There's a number of books I like, but for students, there's a book titled Who Was Ulysses S. Grant? It's about 50 pages long. I recommend that book for you. So if you search Who Was Ulysses S. Grant, you can get that book for your classroom. And I recommend that as a good starting point for General Grant's life. Therese, I tried to answer as much as I could. Really great engagement. And thanks so much for this opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for staying on to answer questions. Thank you to everybody that joined. Loved all your questions and engagement. We hope to see you at future programs. And Nick, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you sharing all your wisdom and answering all these great questions.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you so much. Guys, have a great day. And definitely, if you come to St. Louis, come visit Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site. Bye-bye.